Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start our video with the story in which our OP, a fiber tech at a major ISP, learned to game the system after dealing with a ridiculous attendance policy. Imagine working 50 to 60-hour weeks with no clear sick day rules while being pushed to the brink with little regard for your health. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. Who needs an attendance policy anyways? For 7 years, I worked for a major internet provider in the United States. Most existing technicians were part of a union and had been for quite some time. They had an impressive array of benefits and an impressive hourly pay as well. To get around this, whenever this ISP rolled out the newer fiber-based internet TV phone, they would create a new technician position for completing the installs and repairs. Since this new position wasn't covered by the union contract yet, it has to be voted on and whatnot, the ISP would get a year or two of running these guys ragged for minimal pay and benefits. I was one of those guys, hired on for less than I was making as a department manager working retail in order to work 50 to 60-hour weeks. Once we joined the union, it came with better benefits and pay, but some things got weird. We were an addendum in the contract that covered the old-timers, and as such, a lot of our rules weren't really specified. Honestly, it felt at times our position's benefits was used as a bargaining chip by the old guard to get what they wanted. But I guess that isn't really what is important to the story. What is important to the story is we didn't have an official attendance policy at all. Whenever you would look up the attendance policy in the handbook, it'd tell you to see your manager for details. I finally managed to get a copy of what the manager's handbook said, and it wasn't good. Basically, it recommended using common sense when deciding attendance discipline. Our local managers interpreted this to mean advance to the next step of discipline unless it was literally illegal to do so. This led to some weird situations. One time, after a particularly long install in the southern summer running lines through an attic, I wasn't feeling too well. Definitely signs of dehydration, a headache, dizziness. Wasn't thinking clearly. I called up my boss and said I need to pack it in for the day. He hemmed and hawed over it, didn't sound happy, but after reminding him that we were constantly told safety is our responsibility, aka if something goes wrong, it must have been our fault, he allowed me to return to the garage. Once I was at the garage, however, he told me that in order to not count as a complete absence, I'd need to go to the doctor and file for FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. In order to qualify for FMLA, you have to miss at least 3 days. So, because they wanted to put up a stink about it, went to the doctor, gave him the paperwork, and took the next 3 days off. Turns out I was, to absolutely no shock to me, denied FMLA. Fortunately, when they tried to write me up for attendance, I pointed out that not only did I have permission to stop working that day before returning to the garage, but I was following their instructions by filing for FMLA. They tried to say, in that case, we'll only keep the write-up on file for 90 days and then remove it if you don't have any other absences. The union rep didn't buy that one either. The write-up got torn up before we left the office. But the whole experience taught me a weird lesson about how they handled sick days and occurrences. See, we got 5 paid sick days, but they weren't excused sick days, which meant you could be fired before even using them all since management decided each absence was an instant step of discipline, regardless of reason, despite their guidelines saying to use common sense. But there was a catch. Concurrent absences only counted as one occurrence. Missed 1 day, that was one occurrence. Missed 5 days in a row, still only one occurrence, even if it was separated by a scheduled day off. It was the one rule that was specified in the manager guidelines. You can bet I sure as hell shared that information with all the other technicians. If you were out a single day due to illness, you might as well take an entire week off with pay because you'll never get to use that time otherwise. The managers hated me for it, but I was bitter over the whole FMLA thing and would share that info every single time it came up. They'd threaten to write me up for insubordination, but I'd just tell them we could discuss it in the presence of my union. After all I was doing was sharing information on the attendance policy, the same policy that they used to screw us every chance they got. If your boss has an issue with you sharing the company policy with coworkers, your boss should be fired on the spot. And our second story. Threaten our livelihoods? We'll make you pay. This is a story my mom told me about my grandfather that happened in the late 1950s. Keep in mind that it was a different time back then. My grandfather worked as a milkman his whole life. His company's brand of milk was considered one of the better brands available, and for a very long time it was only available via milkman. It was not in any grocery store, much to the grocery store's dismay. The local grocery store kept asking and then begging the dairy company to please let them sell the milk in their store. Finally, an agreement was made. The milk would be sold in the store, but with a small markup compared to the cost of delivery, so people would have an incentive to keep using the milkman. Where the dairy company went wrong was the agreement on price was not in writing, so while the price of milk started with a markup, that markup soon went away. The dairy company complained, but nothing changed. The grocery store kept the price at the lower amount. Well, the milkmen in particular were not happy with this. This was threatening their livelihoods, so they all talked amongst themselves and made a plan. Throughout the next day, they gathered up their wives and kids and all headed over to the grocery store. Every adult grabbed a cart and started filling it with anything and everything non-perishable they could think of from as many different aisles and shelves as possible. As each one finished piling their cart as high as humanly possible, they'd wheel it to the front, leave it there, and simply walk out. Soon, half the store's items were now go-backs piled in a ton of carts with the shelves looking bare and ragged. The next day, the milkmen checked the price of their milk in the store, no change. Their little demonstration hadn't worked, so they felt they had no choice. They stepped it up a notch. They now started taking all the perishables, anything that was supposed to be kept cool, cold, or hot, and started redistributing these items for the grocery store. The ice cream belongs behind all the cereal boxes, right? And this fish should be put behind the can of peas. The leaking steak goes on top of the shelf behind the chips, etc., etc. By the end of the day, the grocery store was looking at a ton of wastage while praying that they'd found all the starting to rot meat and fermenting dairy before things started to smell too much. The next day, the milkman went back to check the price of milk again. The markup had, for some reason, been added back to the price. Nothing more was ever said about it from workers of either company, but that markup stayed on the milk from then on. Kind of reminds me of how a guy bought the patents for a toothpick maker and then made toothpick an essential item at any general store and fancy restaurant. And our next story. Job wanted work shirts back when I quit. They received a pile of muddy ashes. Back on February 23rd, 2014, Sunday, I was driving home from going clothes shopping for my new job I was starting in a week when my car literally caught on fire with me and my then 4-year-old son in it. I just bought $200 worth of clothes, and my laundry was in the car from the laundromat, including my work shirt and white lab coat. I had already given my notice to my boss that I was leaving, and the next day, Monday, I called in to tell her what had happened and that I would not be in due to smoke inhalation issues and needing to go buy a new car. This was supposed to be my last day. She decides to tell me that I needed to return my 3 work shirts and both lab coats or I'd have the cost garnished from my last check. I told her that they were a pile of ash at the salvage yard. She tells me I have to bring them in. Okay, will do. Insert eye roll and a certain finger flashing from my side of the phone. Tuesday, I walked in with a picture of my laundry basket melted in my car and a Ziploc filled with ashes and mud. I recorded myself giving them to her and telling her again what happened. I got a side eye and a WTF. I walked out with a smirk. Edited to add that I've been at the new job now for 10 years in March. Best move I ever made. Also, my wages never were garnished. I don't think they legally could, but who knows. Now this is malicious compliance at its finest. Well done. And I would have done the same thing. Also, I'm glad your baby got out of that burning car safely 10 years ago. And our last story. Neighbors are building a pool, and the workers damaged our property. One day, I come back from a quick run to the store expecting a regular afternoon. Instead, I'm greeted by a scene straight out of a construction nightmare. My neighbors had decided to put in a pool, and the workers, without a care in the world, had parked their equipment all over my yard. The bobcat they were using had torn up the grass along the side of my house, leaving it looking like a tornado had rolled through. I couldn't even park in my own driveway because their machinery had used it as their personal access point, turning my gravel parking spot into a mess of deep ruts and uneven terrain. It was infuriating. The worst part was they didn't just stop at destroying my yard. My concrete slabs in the backyard were cracked and scraped, and to top it all off, a tree I'd planted in the corner of my yard, my tree, was just gone. Poof, removed without so much as a knock on the door or a courtesy ask. I felt like I was living next to people who thought they owned the whole block. Now, I wish I could say this was the first time I dealt with this neighbor, but no, it wasn't. Karen, yes, I'm calling her Karen because that's exactly what she was, had been a thorn in my side since the day we moved in. The day after we closed on the house, she stopped by introducing herself with that overly sweet, just trying to be helpful tone. Of course, it quickly turned into a lecture about how I needed to keep my trash bins out of sight because they were an eyesore. A week later, she was at it again, complaining that my lawn wasn't edged properly and asking if I needed help finding a landscaping company to get it up to standard. This woman was a professional complainer. So when her pool workers decided to trash my property, I knew deep down she wasn't going to be any help. Still, I thought I'd try the polite route and contacted the pool company directly. I left a voicemail because, of course, they didn't answer. Hours later, I get a call back, and it's the owner on the line. To his credit, he seemed genuinely apologetic. He told me that they'd seen the damage, dirt, and mess across my driveway and assured me they'd make it right. Please don't involve the neighbors in this, he begged, claiming it wasn't their fault. Sure, it wasn't their fault, except that Karen probably watched them tear up my yard with a glass of iced tea in hand, not caring one bit since it wasn't her problem. The pool company promised to get everything fixed, but asked for time since it was a Friday and they needed to schedule a crew for the work. They even sent someone out that afternoon to start cleaning up the big stains on the street, so I thought maybe, just maybe, things would turn around. But then Monday rolls around, and not only had we not heard a word from them, but they weren't picking up our calls anymore. My neighbor, Karen, was no help at all. She didn't even acknowledge the destruction of my yard, just gave me that smug look like she knew this was going to happen and couldn't care less. With the pool company ghosting us and the HOA washing their hands of the whole situation, my partner and I knew we had to take things up a notch. We got a lawyer involved to make sure that our property would be fixed to our satisfaction and at no cost to us. We weren't going to let this slide, and we certainly weren't going to let Karen get away with acting like nothing happened. Luckily, the threat of legal action seemed to shake the pool company into action. A couple of days after our lawyer sent them a notice, they sent out a crew to fix the driveway and the yard. They filled in the ruts, leveled the gravel, and even replanted a new tree where the old one had been removed. They fixed the broken concrete slabs in the backyard too, making sure everything was as good as new. And Karen, she had to sit there and watch as the pool company put my yard back together, knowing full well that this little drama wasn't going to end with her on top. The best part was when I saw her peeking out from behind her curtains as they planted the tree. It was the look of someone who knew she wasn't going to win this one, no matter how much she complained. In the end, my property was restored, and Karen, well, she's kept her complaints to herself, at least for now. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.